In the world of Bigfoot, there are stories and legends that are very difficult to prove, and most historical encounter reports are impossible to prove. So much time has passed, the forests have changed, and the actual experiencers have passed on. But there are a few stories that really leave you wondering. Many encounters happen in extremely remote locations, such as the 1924 Albert Ostman encounter, where in the middle of the night, up the Toba Inlet of British Columbia, prospector Albert Ostman was captured while he was in his sleeping bag by an alleged Sasquatch creature, and held captive for days before making an escape. The thing is, he was the only one there to verify any of the story details, and the exact location of his experience has never been found. But the case I'm talking about today is different. Many witnesses were involved, and the exact experience location is well known, and has been investigated by the top experts in the Bigfoot field. But the craziest thing is, everyone who was present at the encounter died not too long after from various causes. I'm talking about the Ruby Creek incident. This happened in British Columbia in 1941. It's one of the most famous, classic Bigfoot encounters, and one that I truly believe to be legitimate. Welcome to Mountain Beast Mysteries. Hey everyone, welcome to Mountain Beast Mysteries. There's a lot of crazy Bigfoot encounter stories out there, but the ones that really grab hold of people's imaginations are the classic Bigfoot encounters. And the encounter I want to talk about today is the Ruby Creek incident. It's one of the most famous Bigfoot encounters on record. It happened in the summer of 1941, just outside of a place called Ruby Creek in British Columbia. It's a place that's right off the highway, basically. And if you look at the location on the maps here, you can see that. And if we zoom out a bit, you can actually see that the area is like full of wilderness, full of mountains, and there's a lot of area in there that, a Sasquatch creature or multiple Sasquatch creatures could hide. Ruby Creek is surrounded by wilderness, so it's pretty much like every location in British Columbia. Everywhere seems to be surrounded by wilderness. It's just the nature of the area. And throughout history, like a lot of the prominent Bigfoot encounters, a lot of First Nation stories are from that kind of general area in southern British Columbia. But the Ruby Creek incident is really cool because there were multiple witnesses. There were footprints that were left behind. Police officers investigated the site afterwards, and the actual location of the homestead, the cabin that they lived in, it was there. It was ready for people to investigate, basically. It was investigated by Renee DeHinden, by John Green, two really famous Bigfoot researchers, like the most well-known Bigfoot researchers. And they also believed it to be an actual incident that occurred. And I don't know, one of the interesting things about the report is that the Chapman family, the Chapman was their last name, they actually, not long after the experience, just abandoned the place and left. And for, the time, 1941, that's like wartime. I feel like you wouldn't just up and leave your home, when times are tough. Like, those were hard times back in the day. So to have something happen that is able to scare you enough to make you just leave it's your home, that seems kind of crazy to me. So it must have been something very significant that occurred there. It must have been, an actual experience. And like I said, there were multiple people who were there, the whole Chapman family, the 3 kids, the mother. The father was away at work, but he saw the site afterwards where everything was destroyed and there were footprints everywhere. The weird thing about this encounter, though, is that for some reason, the Chapman family all ended up dead not long after. But I'm going to go over the Ruby Creek incident so you guys can hear it all in its glory. I'm reading it just as it is. This report was written by Ivan Sanderson. And it was back in the day, so he uses language that's not really PC, I guess, so don't be offended. I'm just reading it as it is. And it is what it is. So let's have a look at the Ruby Creek incident. Stories about the Sasquatch have been appearing in print from time to time since the 1860s, and I have clippings in my files from almost every year since the early 1920s. But the modern history of the Sasquatch really dates from September 1941, when one of these creatures paid a visit in broad daylight to an Indian family named Chapman. While Native American stories have usually been dismissed as legend or laughed off because Indians are not supposed to be reliable, this experience was accompanied by too much physical evidence to be ignored. The Chapman family consisted of George and Jeannie Chapman and children numbering at my visit 4. Mr. Chapman worked on the railroad and was living at the time in a small place called Ruby Creek, 30 miles up the Fraser River from Agassiz, British Columbia, in Canada's Great Western Province. It was about 3 in the afternoon on a sunny, cloudless day when Jeannie Chapman's eldest son, then aged 9, came running to the house saying that there was a cow coming down out of the woods at the foot of the nearby mountain. The other kids, a boy aged 7 and a little girl of 5, were still playing in a field behind the house bordering the railway track. Mrs. Chapman went out to look since the boy seemed oddly disturbed, and then saw what at first she thought was a very big bear moving about among the bushes bordering the field beyond the railway tracks. She called the 2 children to come running immediately. Then the creature moved onto the tracks, and she saw to her horror that it was a gigantic man covered in hair, not fur. The hair seemed to be about 4 inches long all over, and of a pale yellow-brown color. To pin down this color, Mrs. Chapman pointed out to me a sheet of lightly varnished plywood in the room where we were sitting. This was of a brown ochre color. The creature advanced directly towards the house, and Mrs. Chapman had, as she put it, much too time to look at it, because she stood her ground outside, while the eldest boy, on her instructions, got a blanket from the house and rounded up the other children. The kids were in a near panic, she told us, and it took about 2 or 3 minutes to get the blanket, during which time the creature had reached the corner of the field only about 100 feet away from her. Mrs. Chapman then spread the blanket and held it aloft so that the kids could not see the creature or it them. She backed off at the double to the old field and down onto the river beach, out of sight, and then ran with the kids downstream to the village. I asked her a leading question about the blanket. Had her purpose in using it been to prevent her kids from seeing the creature, in accord with an alleged Native American belief that to do so brings bad luck and often death? Her reply was both prompt and surprising. She said that, although she had heard white men tell of that belief, she had not heard it from her parents or any of her people whose advice regarding the so-called Sasquatch had been simply not to go further than certain points up certain valleys, to run if she saw one, and not to struggle if one caught her, as it might squeeze her to death by mistake. No, she said, I used the blanket because I thought it was after one of the kids, and so might go into the house to look for them instead of following me. This seems to have been sound logic, as the creature did go into the house, and also rummaged through an old outhouse pretty thoroughly, hauling from it a 55-gallon barrel of salted fish, breaking it open and scattering its contents about outside. The irony of it is that all those 3 children did die within 3 years. The 2 boys by drowning, and the little girl on a sickbed. And just after I interviewed the Chapmans, they also drowned in the Fraser River when a rowboat capsized. Mrs. Chapman told me that the creature was about 7.5 feet tall. She could estimate its height by the various fence and line posts standing about the field. It had a rather small head and a very short, thick neck. In fact, really no neck at all. A point that was emphasized by William Rowe and by all others who claimed to have seen one of these creatures. Its body was entirely human in shape, except that it was immensely thick through its chest and its arms were exceptionally long. She did not see the feet, which were in the grass. Its shoulders were very wide, and it had no breasts, from which Mrs. Chapman assumed it was a male, though she did not see any male genitalia due to the long hair covering its groin. She was almost definite on one point. The naked parts of its face and its hands were much darker than its hair, and appeared to be almost black. George Chapman returned home from his work on the railroad that day shortly before 6 in the evening and by a route that bypassed the village, so that he saw no one to tell him what had happened. When he reached the house, he immediately saw the woodshed door battered in, and spotted enormous humanoid footprints all over the place. Greatly alarmed, for he, like all of his people, had heard since childhood about the big wild men of the mountains, though he did not hear the word Sasquatch till after this incident. He called for his family and then dashed through the house. Then he spotted the footprints of his wife and kids going off towards the river. He followed these until he picked them up on the sand beside the river and saw them going off downstream without any giant ones following. Somewhat relieved, he was retracing his steps when he stumbled across the giant's footprints on the river bank farther upstream. These had come down out of the potato patch, which lay between the house and the river, and milled about by the river, and then gone back through the old field towards the foot of the mountains where they disappeared into the heavy growth. Returning to the house, relieved to know that the tracks of all 4 of his family had gone off downstream to the village, George Chapman went to examine the woodshed. In our interview, after 18 years, he still expressed voluble astonishment that any living thing, even a 7-foot 6-inch man with a barrel chest, could lift a 55-gallon tub of fish and break it open without using a tool. He confirmed the creature's height after finding a number of long brown hairs stuck in the slab wood lintel of the doorway, above the level of his head. George Chapman then went off to the village to look for his family, and found them in a state of calm collapse. He gathered them up and invited his father-in-law and 2 others to return with him for protection of his family when he was away at work. The footprints returned every night for a week, and on 2 occasions, the dog that the Chapmans had taken with them set up the most awful racket at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. The Sasquatch did not, however, molest them or apparently touch either the house or the woodshed. But the whole business was too unnerving, and the family finally moved out. They never went back. After a long chat about this and other matters, Mrs. Chapman suddenly told us something very significant just as we were leaving. She said, "It made an awful funny noise." I asked her if she could imitate the noise for me, but it was her husband who did so, saying that he had heard it at night twice during the week after the first incident. He then proceeded to utter exactly the same strange gurgling whistle that men in California who said they had heard a Bigfoot call had given us. This is a sound I cannot reproduce in print, but I can assure you it's unlike anything that I have ever heard given by man or beast anywhere in the world. To me, this information is of the greatest significance, that a Native American couple in British Columbia should give out with exactly the same strange sound in connection with a Sasquatch that 2 highly educated white men did over 600 miles south in connection with California's Bigfoot. If this is all a hoax or a publicity stunt or a mass hallucination, as some people have claimed, how does it happen that this noise, which defies description, always sounds the same no matter who has tried to reproduce it for me? These were probably the last words on the Sasquatch that the Chapmans uttered, and I absolutely refused to listen to anybody who might say they were lying. Admittedly, honest men are such a rarity as possibly to be non-existent, but I've met a few who could qualify, and I put the Chapmans near the head of that list. So this Sasquatch creature was first seen by the children, and they described it as being a cow. And as a kid, you don't really know what you're looking at when you see something so alarming like a Sasquatch. It's something you've never even heard of. Like, this is before Bigfoot was popular and the word Bigfoot wasn't even around. And the Chapmans said in their report, like, they didn't even know of the word Sasquatch until afterwards. So as a kid, I don't think it's really crazy to see something like that and to say it's a cow. It's just something you'd relate it to. Actually, I drove through that area not long ago, like a few years ago, and there was a little interpretive display I saw off the highway, and it was talking about how a lot of Sasquatch reports from back in the day were actually misidentified sightings of camels, because I guess back in like the gold rush days, they used camels in British Columbia to haul equipment and whatnot. And so after they were done using the camels, they would just cut them loose, and there'd be camels roaming the forests of British Columbia. And they think some Bigfoot reports might have been sightings of camels, like when you're looking at a camel head on. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's just like an excuse to like try and discredit Bigfoot sightings. I don't know. But I guess it's possible to see something like a camel or a cow and think it's a Bigfoot, but in this story, Mrs. Chapman got a real good look at this thing, and she describes it in detail, and it's like your typical, Bigfoot sighting. There's nothing that is unusual about it in that sense. It's your classic Bigfoot, wide shoulders, long arms, hair that's like 4 to 5 inches long, and this thing was making weird sounds, and when you hear how he describes it, sounds like a whistling and gurgling noises. It's not hard to imagine the Sierra sounds recorded by Ron Moorhead, the crazy Sierra sounds where you can hear them like talking and yelling at each other. Apparently a track cast was also taken from the site, by the police officer, and I don't know what ended up happening to it, but supposedly there was an actual track cast taken. This thing came back again and again for a couple weeks, and eventually it disappeared. But it would come back and it would make weird noises, and it was enough to scare them off to actually, you know, pack up and leave, which is insane. Like I said, to be doing something like that in 1941 seems really odd. You know, World War II is going on. Resources are limited. You're gonna abandon your home? It would take something really crazy to make you do that, I think. But the weirdest thing to me about this story is how all of them passed away after. You'll hear First Nations people say that if you look at Sasquatch in the eyes, it's like it'll bring on bad luck. And apparently Mrs. Chapman never heard that. She didn't think that was a thing. But personally, I spent a little bit of time in Harrison Hot Springs, and me and Keenan from the Alberta Sasquatch organization were there, and we spent some time with the local chief that was in the area. And he had a personal story when he was younger of, you know, seeing a Sasquatch, and he knew, because, you know, he was taught not to look these things in the eyes because it would be bad luck. So he actually was told that, and he saw this thing, but it wasn't facing him, and he knew like not to look it in the eyes. So he just kind of like saw it, and then that was it. He didn't stick around, you know, to have the chance to look it in the eyes. But it is a thing that you will hear. So I wonder if that's what happened, if they all looked this thing in the eyes and ended up dying, because all the kids died, and then the Chapmans drowned in a boating accident. It just seems crazy that it happened to all of them, and they had this crazy Sasquatch experience. So I wonder if that part of the mythology is true. You know, don't look Sasquatch in the eyes. It's, you know, there's been many people since then who have encountered Sasquatch and have looked it in the eyes, and people haven't died, so it's hard to say. It could just be a crazy coincidence. But this is a Sasquatch encounter that I do think actually happened. And it's really cool to be able to have a location that you can go and actually investigate, to be, you know, at ground zero. Because a lot of other reports, such as the Albert Osman encounter, like, they have not been able to track down where that happened. It was up the Toba Inlet somewhere, you know, dense, lush wilderness, really rough terrain out there, mountainous terrain. It'd be really hard to find the actual spot where he was taken and held captive by Bigfoot. But I just wanted to share this story because I haven't talked about it in a long time, in years actually, and there's a lot of new subscribers to the channel. So the Ruby Creek incident is one of the most fascinating. You know, you can dig into it more online if you want to. There's lots of information out there on it, and you can find all kinds of images of the actual site. And I don't know, I just think it's legit. So thanks for watching this video. We'll see you next time on Mountain Beast Mysteries.